First of all, this event, as Gordon said, is sponsored in part by the CSCA, which is a multidisciplinary group of scientists and others interested in the intersection of science and faith. We have chapters across Canada. The one here in the Vancouver area, which is putting these lectures on, 3 with Psi this week. And we're also a branch of the American Scientific Affiliation, which is an international network of Christians in science. Several notable scientists are members of this group, including the head of NIH, who you've heard a lot about recently, Dr. Francis Collins, and the eminent climate scientist, Katharine Hayhoe, as well as some past Nobelists. Together, we publish the academic journal, Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith. I'm on the editorial board, and an online magazine called God and Nature, which includes photo essays and more personal discussion. Psi has been the editor of God and Nature for several years, along with his wife, Anniko. CSCA, as I said, sponsored 2 other lectures this week at Regent and Trinity Western, and you can view them and all kinds of information about CSCA by going to the website csca.ca. So that's easy to remember, csca.ca. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend Cy Garte. I have fond memories of being next to Cy and his lovely wife Anniko at a sing-along with Francis Collins a few years ago. That was quite a memorable experience. Cy has held tenured positions at New York University, Pittsburgh, and Rutgers U, my original alma mater, and he's worked at NIH. He's also an advisor, has been an advisor for the Templeton Foundation, and participates in BioLogos. He's very active in the ASA, in particular in the leadership of the local DC chapter, and as an author. He writes for the journal Perspectives and is, as I said, co-editor of God and Nature. Cy is also author of over 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles, some in Nature, a book on environmental health issues, and is editor of a few books on molecular epidemiology. His most recent book is The Works of His Hands. I guess you can see it on the shelf behind Cy there. Works of His Hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. Yes, backwards on mine. Yeah, he's active on Twitter as well and Facebook, and he has a very interesting YouTube channel that I recommend. So over to you, Cy.
Thank you, Judy. That was a great introduction, very thorough. You mentioned some things I'd forgotten myself. Anyway, very happy to be here. This, as Judy mentioned, this is the 3rd of my presentations in the Vancouver area this week. My only regret is that I'm not there in person, although, as I said, the first night, the hotel accommodations are just like home, so there's some benefit there. Hopefully I'll get to Vancouver in the flesh someday, but we'll see. Yeah, I would like to talk about my book. First thing I'd like to say is that if you are interested in, I mean, usually when one does a book talk, you know, it's possible to buy books and sign, and the author signs them. That's not going to happen tonight, obviously. But I do send signed, personalized, signed adhesive book plates to anyone who wants them. If you do get a book or you have a book, just look up cygarte.com. That's my website. And when you go to the contact page, you'll see a place where you can just request a signed book plate, and I'll send that to you. So that's the best I can do during the pandemic for signing books. I would like to talk a little bit about what the subtitle of the book is, which is A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. And many of you may have already read or heard about some other people who started out as atheists and eventually became Christians or people of faith. And my story is a little different from most. I do know one or two other people who have similar stories, but what's different is where I started from, which was I wasn't just an atheist in that, you know, my parents didn't go to church or weren't really very interested in religion. I grew up in a family that was hostile to religion, actively hostile. My parents were communists. They were members of the American Communist Party in the 30s. They came from a family background of communists, including people who had fought in the Russian Revolution and so on, Spanish Civil War. So my pedigree is quite left. And part of that worldview, which I took on as a child, was a very strong degree of anti-theism. It wasn't simply that I didn't believe in God. I knew that religion was one of the great evils of human history. Christianity was among the worst thing that ever happened. And that was how I grew up. And at some point, I decided that I was really interested in science. That was partially a result of my worldview, my general overview of reality as being, you know, purely materialistic, deterministic, reductionist, all the things that atheists hold to. And also partially because my father, besides being an atheist, was a chemist and had a lot of influence on me. And I did major in chemistry in college. Then when I went to graduate school, I revolted a little bit and became a biochemist. So my doctoral degree is in biochemistry, and I studied biology and various aspects of molecular biology from then on, and became a research scientist. Now, people have asked me at various times whether I felt any kind of a lack of something having no religion. I mean, we didn't celebrate any holidays except for New Year's Day, which is the day that the Soviet Union gives children their gifts. So that's what we did. There were no other holidays, and I never set foot in a church until I was in my 40s, which is, I'll probably mention in a minute. And people have asked me whether I felt some kind of a lack of spirituality, which is many of us feel is a normal thing, and I do too. I think it's normal to feel spiritual, and it may not be an accident that many of what we used to call red diaper babies, the children of communists who were brought up in that milieu and who had no faith experiences and no experience of spirituality, many of them actually did get religious, often went to Eastern religions or various kinds of spirituality that was popular in the 60s. Looking around, I think maybe a few of you might remember that. But I found a different way to fill that gap of spirituality, of something more than just normal life. And the way I filled that gap was through science. When I began to learn about biology, especially the details in biochemistry about how life works, I found it not just beautiful, but inspiring and spiritually uplifting. I thought science was wonderful. I still do. I decided that's what I wanted to spend my life doing. And also I liked the idea that this was the way you could get real knowledge and be sure of it. Whereas I was quite sure from everything I had heard that religion was just something that you hoped for and dreamed about and had no background in truth. And you'll hear a lot of atheists these days online say, oh, it's much better to be right or to know the truth than to believe in something which is, you know, wishful thinking. And that was exactly where I stood. But I had a problem, and this is documented in the first 3 or 4 chapters of my book. And my problem was that the more I learned about science, and this goes along with Werner Heisenberg's famous quote, which is something like, the first gulp of science leads you to atheism, but as you drain the glass, you see God at the bottom. And I was draining that glass, and things about science were starting to question some of my original beliefs and viewpoints. When I learned about quantum mechanics, I got quite shaken by some of the very strange truths that quantum mechanics tells us about our universe. I'm not going to go into detail in that. There's some discussion of it in the book. One of the chapters is called The Irrational World of Quantum Mechanics. And the more I was learning about various things, including my own field of biology, the more I began questioning my materialism and my strict views on, the concept that we can understand and know everything about the universe by the scientific method. I just began to see that the scientific method itself, the results of science itself, were pointing in other directions. I have some discussion about complexity theory, fractals, chaos, and other things that in a chapter called Science Surprises, which led me to understand that the universe may be intelligible, but it's incredibly complex. And its intelligibility was a little bit in question. And what really struck me was when I began studying advanced biochemistry, and I remember being in a classroom when I first was learning about protein synthesis. Now, I don't know if there are any other biochemists here, but I'll just summarize to say that the way that cells make the proteins that they need, all the enzymes and all the things that make up the cell, is remarkable. And it is a incredibly complex process that looks like some kind of a human design factory where things move around and come in and bind to each other. It's all chemistry, of course, biochemistry, but it raises the question, how did this develop? And well, I knew the answer because the answer to all such questions in biology was discovered by Charles Darwin, and that is evolution. Anytime you see something incredibly beautiful or ornate or appearing designed in biology, I knew that the answer is, well, it's evolution. Evolution creates everything that we see that we find beautiful. That's certainly the impression one gets when reading Richard Dawkins or any of the other atheist biologists. The problem is that the protein synthesis system sort of bothered me because you can't have evolution without a protein synthesis system, at least not the evolution we know about. Now, there may be an earlier kind of evolution that occurred in cells before that, but we don't know what that system is, and we don't have any theories even for what that is. So I decided when I was told that I would be giving 3 talks here that I would give a small introduction to my journey, and then I would devote a little bit of time to reading short sections of the book. But I decided to do 3 different topics. So in the first topic at Regent, I talked about humanity, people, and how the Imago Dei and human exceptionalism became consistent with my faith. And earlier today at Trinity Western, I talked about some of the personal experiences that brought me directly to faith. All of this is from the book. Today, now here at UBC, I want to talk about this issue of the origin of life and some specific parts of it, which I think are of interest. Let me just finish up this introduction by saying that eventually what I was learning from science completely destroyed my original belief in pure materialism, and I became an agnostic. I was not clear about any alternative to scientific worldview, but I did eventually get to a church, thanks to an invitation from a friend. I did eventually actually look at the Bible, which I'd never opened, and found that interesting and compelling. And little by little, my mind began opening more and more to the possibility of theism. And eventually, as I like to put it, the Lord had mercy on me, and I had several personal experiences, including dreams, and one direct experience with the Holy Spirit, which I'm not going to talk about. It's in the book, and I can describe it a little if there's questions, but I don't want to go into detail right now. And the result of that, which was about 15 years ago, not very long ago, I was already in my late 50s, early 60s. As a result of that last experience, I became a Christian for real. And a few years later, I joined a church. I was baptized 6 years ago, and I became the lay leader of my church, United Methodist Church, and I've retired, 5 years retired, and I've spent my rest of my life since then working at the church and working particularly in, as Judy mentioned, the issue of the intersection between science and faith in the ASA and at various other organizations. And this is why I wrote the book, which was basically oriented towards a target audience of students and others who maybe were brought up in a Christian home, but then went to college and learned science and began wondering, or maybe some were even told by some professors that they had to choose between what they knew as children in Christianity and what they now knew as the truth in science. And the whole purpose of what I'm trying to do, and I'm not alone, many others, including most of the ASA and the CSCA, what we're trying to do is show that that choice is false, that you can have absolute Christian faith, you can be a Bible-believing Christian and embrace science in all of its aspects. So that's sort of an introduction to where I started from and roughly how I got where I am, although, as I said, the details are fill up the whole book. So if more interest, you can look at that, or you can ask me during the question period. What I want to do now is sort of read an introduction to what I want to talk about, which is some of the issues around origin of life. And this is a brief section from a chapter called Origins, where I talk about the three main origins that we don't know much about, which is the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of human consciousness. And I'm going to read a little bit from that section. So I should say that the system of protein synthesis is often called translation. It's the translation of the genetic code from nucleic acid chemistry to protein chemistry, so that the nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, which carry the genetic code that's inherited, are able to make exactly the correct proteins that the cell needs. If the modern translation system with the genetic code did gradually evolve, like all other biological systems, then it must have started out much simpler and much more susceptible to errors. One problem with that is that unless this system is almost error-free, no evolution is possible. Below a certain threshold of accuracy, genetic improvements in the function of the proteins, RNA, and cofactor molecules that are part of this complex system will not be handed down, will not be inherited, and thus no selection will take place. So how did something as novel as the symbolic information of the genetic code arise? There are some theories, but little evidence. The proponents of intelligent design claim that any spontaneous naturalistic explanation for the origin of the genetic code is simply impossible. The problem with that approach is that even assuming that God is the author of the code and of life, which I do assume, there may still be a discoverable natural mechanism by which God acted to create. All of nature is created by God, including everything for which we have found natural mechanisms. In any case, the genetic code is far more than an interesting chemical novelty. Eugene Koonin, a leader in the field of abiogenesis research, who is not a theist, in fact, he's an atheist, has acknowledged the difficulty. Quote, "The translation system might appear to be the epitome of irreducible complexity, because although some elaborations of this machinery could be readily explainable by incremental evolution, the emergence of the basic principle of translation is not. Indeed, we are unaware of translation being possible at all without the involvement of ribosomes, a complete set of tRNA and amino-acyl tRNA synthetases, those are enzymes, and at least for translation to occur at a reasonable rate and accuracy, several translation factors. In other words, staggering complexity is inherent even in the minimally functional translation system." So that might have been a little technical, but basically what that section is saying is that you gotta have protein synthesis that is accurate and accurate to a level of at least 99.99% before you can have actual evolution. Because remember, evolution is the copying of everything from one cell to another, or in the case of animals, one animal to another. But when we start out with individual cells, we're talking about one cell splitting into two cells and passing forward any improvements that occurred by mutation, for example, accurately. Because if that passing forward does not occur, then the cell that has the benefit may do fine, but its offspring are just like everyone else. The way I like to talk about it is if you have a bird who gets a mutation and now has fantastic eyesight, that bird will do great. It'll catch all the food that the other birds miss. But if the bird does not pass on that mutation, that change in the DNA that allows for better eyesight, the offspring don't do any better than any other offspring, and there's no evolution. There's no natural selection. So you have to start out before evolution can work. You have to start out with an extremely accurate copying mechanism. Now, the analogy I often use, and this is in one of my recent videos, is suppose you see a house you really like, you love the look of the house, and you want a copy of it. You could do that. You could get an architect and say, I want to build this house somewhere. But not only that, you don't only want the house, you want the plumbing systems, you want the electrical systems, and you also want all the contents of the house. You want all the books, all the paintings, all the furniture, everything exact. If they have a dog, you want the dog too, a copy of the dog. We'll leave that for now. But all the rest of the house, you want exactly copied. You could do that. It's not impossible. It would be very, very difficult. Think of all the books and all the, little things that are in the house you get copies of. Well, that's exactly what a cell does when it divides. It makes an exact copy of all its contents. Every protein are the same. Now, there's slight changes, very, very tiny changes. But as I said, less than 0.001% are changed. And although we would find it difficult to do that copying of a house and all its contents, now suppose I said to you, I want a house that copies itself. That's not possible. No house can copy itself. In fact, nothing copies itself. The only things that copy themselves are living cells. Not even molecules copy themselves. DNA doesn't copy itself, nor does RNA, nor does any protein. And if you want to come up with arguments to that, good, because I've already had all of them, and I can answer things like prions and other things. But actually, the reality is that cells are able to copy themselves. And the way they do it is simply by copying their DNA, which is the instruction manual to copy all the rest. And the way they copy all the rest is through this translation system. So that's remarkable. And what does that tell us? It tells us that life is mysterious. And it also tells us that evolution, while it's a great answer to explain how butterflies are so beautiful and how flowers are so beautiful and how sharks live, explains everything we know about biology except how it started. Because one thing we know is that just as physicists can't go back in time before the Big Bang, we cannot go back in time before a particular cell that we call the last universal common ancestor, from which all other cells evolved. And we call that LUCA, L-U-C-A. But here's the thing. LUCA already has a almost perfectly functioning protein synthesis system. It has the genetic code. It has very complex energy conversion systems. It has metabolism. It has a huge amount of stuff that it does, and we can't find out how any of that developed. Now, there are theories, and abiogenesis is an active field of research. I know several of the people in the field, and there's lots of good ideas about RNA world that came first, and then somehow that turned into DNA world. And there's some data that supports some of those ideas, but we are very, very far from coming close to an actual possibility of how all of this could have happened. And I do want to say one more thing about this before I stop, and that is, you heard when I read the quote from Eugene Koonin, you heard him say that this is an example of irreducible complexity. Now that might ring a bell with you, because that, of course, when the ID people saw that, they rejoiced and they used it. And, you know, irreducible complexity is the concept that there are some things that you can't evolve to because they're too complex. Now, some of the ID people limit that to the origin of life, and I agree with that. Some of them use it for all of evolution, and that has been shown probably not to be true. Things that appear to be irreducibly complex have turned out to actually be more complicated, and evolutionary mechanisms have been found to explain that. And so far, nothing during evolution has really been proven to be irreducibly complex. But that doesn't relate to the origin of life. And as we should know, origin of life is not part of evolution. There is no evolutionary mechanism that explains origin of life, nor does anyone try to. However, what has happened recently is that certain atheist groups have looked at some of these claims and refuted them. And sometimes they've refuted them correctly. But more recently, I have become quite concerned with some refutations of this idea of complex origin of life, which actually refutes the science. Now, these claims are not being made by other scientists. They're being made mostly by atheist philosophers on social media. And what really has gotten me concerned is a popular meme now, which is that DNA is not a language. And many of you may know about the book, The Language of God by Francis Collins, which was and remains the major book in the field of compatibility between science and faith. And in that book, Collins, who is probably the world leading authority on genetics, talked about how the sequence of DNA and the genetic code is the language of life. So what has happened is there are people now saying that DNA is not a language, that there is no code, it's just chemistry. Now, these are not chemists, nor are they biochemists, so I have no idea what they mean. But it's a very misguided attempt, in my view, to attack, let's say, intelligent design or other creation ideas by attacking what we know as established science. It's unusual, perhaps, for you to hear someone talk about atheist distortion of science. We usually hear about that from people who believe in young earth creationism and other people who use religion instead of science. But here we're finding one example, and there are others, but I won't go into them, of a refutation of established science for the purpose of promoting atheism. I made a video, it's a refutation of a video made in 2017 by an atheist named Stephen Woodford in Great Britain, who's called Rationality Rules. And in his video, he talks about why DNA is not a language. And unfortunately, he gets the biochemistry all wrong. So I try to point out where the errors are. But I think one thing that I want to stress is that it's very, if you agree that science, as I do, and as all my colleagues do in the ASA and other places, that science is really the best way to describe the natural world. And there's no reason to reject anything in science as a person of faith. You also, I believe, should agree that it's important for us who are scientists, whether Christian or not, to not accept an attack by some atheists on established scientific reality for the purpose of making an argument against the existence of God. And so I feel strongly about this issue, and I thought I would raise it here with this group, and happy to discuss it further if anyone's interested. I think that's where I'll stop for now, and I'm happy to get questions on origin of life, on what I just said, and also on anything else about my journey and my background related, or anything about Christianity and science that I know.
Thanks very much, Sai. And I think perhaps we'll open it up to the audience, since I can see that this is a very respectable group. And so if someone has a question for Sai, you can just unmute your microphone and ask him directly rather than through the chat. But I found in your book that very interesting point you were beginning to talk about, that there are three key beginnings that really caught your attention.
Right.
The origin of everything, physics, etc. The origin of the bios, or life itself, and then the origin of human consciousness. And I thought, yeah, that was very helpful. If you wanted to say more about that, how those three things kind of came together in your mind as a kind of light bulb. Insight. Yeah,
I would actually. That's exactly what did happen. At some point, when I was learning about, well, I was very interested in consciousness at some point. I was trying to understand what is consciousness, and I did a lot of reading. I don't suggest anyone do that, because there's a huge amount written and it says very, very little. The only actual theories I could come up with about consciousness was, first, that it's emergent, and you'll hear that word a lot, which doesn't really tell us much, or that it's not real, which was Daniel Dennett's view in Consciousness Explained. It's an illusion. I don't believe it's an illusion. I think it's real. It may be emergent, but I don't know what emergence means. And I mean, I know what it means, but it doesn't really tell us much. You use emergence when you have a very complex system, and it's used in chemistry, which gets to a level of complexity where it changes quickly, and you can't explain the change. And this happens, for example, when water changes its state. It goes from a liquid to a solid, or vice versa. And it happens in many areas of science. And so, we had the origin of the universe, which emerged from who knows what. That's unknown. That's a big mystery. And then we had the emergence of classical physics from the original quantum physics. And then we had the emergence of chemistry, molecular bonds between atoms, and the emergence of biology from chemistry, and, and then the emergence of consciousness from biology. Mm-hmm. So that all it's not explaining anything. It's just raising the question, what is all this emergence that's going on in the universe? How does it happen? And I think those three origins that you mentioned are, in fact, good examples of interesting questions that we know almost nothing about. I mean, I don't know which of those three we know the least about. Actually, origin of life, we probably know a little more than the other two. But consciousness, we can't even define it very well. It's a qualia, it's the sense of being. There are all kinds of words that are used, but what is it? It has to do with our brains, probably. It's a very complex thing that occurs in complex brains, but we don't really know. And of course, the origin of the universe is an open question. So yeah, those three things, actually, when I first started thinking about writing a book, it was going to be just about that. That these are the three big issues that, as scientists, maybe they're pointing us towards theism, because maybe that's an answer. I don't know if it is, but I don't think it hurts. So that was very important in the genesis of my thinking. Yes.
Or can I come in with a question?
There's Mike Davenport. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for this talk. I really appreciate it. So I want to come back to what you were talking about with evolution. I'm a physicist. I read about evolution, but I'm not able to talk about it from a scientific point of view. But I do have these conversations over lunch with science friends, and I think they ask one really good question about this. I've found ways to answer them, but I would really love to hear yours. And that is, they say, well, evolution is so brutal. How is this the activity of a loving God? And for them, that's partly argumentative, but frankly, it can also be very personal. If you know someone who's been born with some sort of a mutation which has plagued them all their lives, then that becomes more than a scientific argument, a personal argument.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, finish. Finish your question.
Yeah, well, the second half of that is that I've seen some videos lately from Christians. I believe they're Christians talking about new calculations, which suggest that we are orders and orders of magnitude short of enough time for this all to have happened by accident. And if you could elaborate on that, I'd be interested.
Okay, so that's two separate questions. So the question about evolution being cruel has come up a lot. And my answer to that is, well, what's the alternative? If we don't have what we have now from evolution, then where did we get it? We got it from special creation of every organism. That means God deliberately created things that we don't like, deliberately created bacteria, viruses, created us with the possibility of inborn diseases. It's not evolution that's cruel, it's life that's cruel. And how we explain the way life is doesn't add to the cruelty. So I don't see any way. I mean, we're talking about the issue of theodicy. Why is there evil in the world if it was created by a good God? And I don't see evolution as making anything worse. I see it just as an explanation of how we can get diversity. And we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a fallen world, in a world where there is sin, there is evil, the world is groaning. This is not the kingdom. We're waiting for that. And I mean, I don't have an answer to the problem of evil. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to say is that the problem of evil, evolution doesn't belong in there. In terms of the question of timing, there is an issue with timing. It doesn't have to, I mean, it doesn't really have to do with evolution from the beginning, because we know, for example, at this point, it's quite remarkable. We believe that the first cells were developed very quickly after the primeval Earth cooled to a reasonable temperature. And that seems strange. I mean, how could that have happened? But once that happened, it took a 1.5 billion years, or actually more like 2 billion years, before we had multi-celled creatures. So for the first major part of Earth's history, only thing that was alive were bacteria and other kinds of single cells. So that's a lot of time. And during that period, there was slow microevolution. Bacteria were getting better and better at what they were doing, I guess. Nobody knows. And then we ended up with multicellular creatures about 500 million years ago. And then evolution took off in plants and animals. Now, was there not enough time? Well, let's look at one alternative to the evolutionary story, which is the young Earth creationist story of Answers in Genesis. They also believe in evolution. They believe that God created all the kinds of animals, which then got on the ark during the flood. And at the end of the flood, those animals got off the ark, and they were not all the animals we see today. There's no ark could have been big enough for that, but they were representative kinds, baramins, created kinds. So there was a cat kind and a dog kind and a bear kind and an antelope kind, and whatever. And after the flood, the cat kind evolved into all the modern cats we see. Now, that story is fine. It uses actual evolution, natural selection, mutation, all the things that, evolutionists believe happened, and they agree with that, only they think it happened after the flood. That would mean evolution was about 30 times faster than what we think it is. And so was there enough time for that? That would require an incredibly high mutation rate. So there isn't much escaping the idea of evolution by natural selection. The only part of it that is really should raise eyebrows is, how did life get started so fast? And I've just been talking about how hard it is to start life, how difficult it is. And, one theory is that, well, maybe life arrived on a comet or something, panspermia, which is possible, but it doesn't answer the question, because then where did that come from? So, I don't find a strong objection anywhere in science or even in theology to the concept of God using evolution as a tool to create life. I don't think it is any worse than any other, worse in terms of morality, worse in terms of evil, worse than any other mechanism to create life. And I don't see the timing issue as really an issue, again, compared to any alternative.
Well, the Christian story is that God decided, let there be life, right? And then,
Yes.
I mean, that doesn't exactly say that in scripture, but it does basically say, let there be life.
Right.
And so that solves the timing problem for Christians.
Well,
And,
I agree.
Yeah.
Let me just interrupt for a second. My own view, which is theological and not scientific, is that God did create life. And that therefore I agree with exactly what you said, but I can't prove that scientifically.
Right.
However, what I'm trying to say here is that the science is kind of going in that direction.
Right.
Right. That's what I'm trying to say. And not every scientist agrees with me. There are lots of folks at Biologos and even at ASA who may not agree with that. But I would say that, yeah, it looks like that's the direction science is going. And theologically, I believe it's true. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I should let others in. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Mike. Other questions?
I see two. Barry?
Barry, could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Quick question, well, probably not a quick question. Simon Conway Morris's book, Life's Solution, has that
Right.
wonderful subtitle, Inevitable Life in a Lonely Universe. Is that the way you see things?
Inevitable humans in a lonely
Sorry,
universe.
inevitable humans in a lonely
Right.
universe. Yeah. Is that the way you see it? I mean, and does that have some idea for life in the universe?
Yeah, that's actually a really hard question, but let me see what I can do. Yeah, so that's a wonderful book. I recommend it to everyone. Simon Conway Morris, who I've met, is a great scientist, great guy. He has really started a field by himself. Well, there have been some precursors, but he's really developed it to perfection, which is the field of evolutionary convergence. And this is all science. I mean, he is a Christian, but he's a marvelous biologist, and that's what he writes about. And what he has shown is that during evolution is not random and accidental. Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist who passed away, had said that if you wound the clock of evolution back and then let the tape run again, you get something completely different, because evolution is just accidental, random, and you never know what's going to happen. Conway Morris has proven that false, because it turns out that not everything can happen. Things go along certain very well-defined pathways. And we don't know why, although we can guess. And so the ability to fly has evolved independently. I don't remember how many times, 40 times, 100 times, many, many times. Radar, intelligence even, all kinds of biological characteristics seem to be like points of convergence, so that many, many different lines. Oh, the vertebrate eye is a big one, okay? The vertebrate eye turns out is also present in invertebrates, such as the octopus, the same design of the eye. And it didn't come from evolution, because these are separate branches. They don't talk to each other. So the same thing evolved over and over again. What does that suggest? That suggests several things. It could suggest the designer. It could suggest that there are patterns in evolutionary development that are fixed by some laws that we don't know yet. Michael Denton has proposed this. He is a member of the Discovery Institute. He holds to normal, regular evolution and common descent, but he also holds to alternatives to Darwinism, such as the idea of, I think it's John Owen in the 19th century, who held that there were natural laws that determined what would happen in life, just as in other things. And it's very exciting. Conway Morris's results are fascinating, because they suggest a real pattern. But you asked me something slightly different, which was how this results to the title or the subtitle. And I tend to believe that life, and this is very controversial, and it's only my own belief. I am skeptical about a huge amount of life in the universe. And that's not based on any theology. It's based only on science. And it's based, in my case, on what I think is the extreme unlikelihood of the development of life, even on a planet like ours, which is perfect for life. And even if there were many, many, millions of planets just like ours, I don't think they would all have life. I think very few of them would. And to explain why I think that, I would have to go into a lot of detail about all the objections I have to a spontaneous, easy development of life, and that would take too long. But it's a fascinating subject, so I thank you for bringing it up. I think I saw another question. Yes. Is that Mr. Johns? R. Johns? You'll have to unmute.
Sorry, it's Richard. Yeah, it's got my
Richard, okay.
my work email up there. Yeah. So I was just following on from Mike Davenport's question a little bit. I have read a lot of this stuff by Mike Behe and others about how it's difficult for evolution by natural selection to accomplish sort of gain of function in an organism. so Behe's not a young Earth creationist. I
No.
guess some kind of old Earth creationist, but he suggests that to gain a new function in an organism, you can't just have one small mutation. You know, you can
That's
have
correct.
several coordinated mutations, and singly, these aren't really going to improve fitness. You kind of need the full package.
Yeah.
But then you've got a problem with the waiting time for all those mutations to occur in the same organism. He has a paper with him and Snoke on this, and he also wrote a book. So I think that might be what Mike was referring to.
Yeah.
You've got major transitions like from a walking whale to an aquatic whale in maybe only 5 million years.
Right.
And yet just waiting for one pair of mutations, if I'm right, could take hundreds of millions of years. Is that
Okay.
kind of problem?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that problem. There are two answers I can come up with. One is that a single point mutation, you're right, probably never does a gain of function by itself. What we're now finding is that when Darwin talked about variation, he admitted he had no idea what the mechanism was. And then people discovered point mutations in DNA and decided that must be the mechanism for evolution. And in some cases, it has been, but usually what we call microevolution. However, what we now know is that there are a lot more mechanisms for genetic variation than point mutations in a reading frame. For example, there are these transposons which affect the expression of genes more than the actual function of the actual structural sequence of genes. And when you change the expression of genes, for example, I'll just give one example. There's a transposon that inserted itself in front of a expression factor called a promoter, so that a whole series of genes are not expressed. And that was critical to the development of all the complicated things that go on in mammalian pregnancy. Okay, so you get these sudden dramatic changes where many genes are turned off, or many genes are turned on, and you occasionally will get a major change in the phenotype of the organism.
And do you see new sort of machinery emerging by?
Yeah. You can see new things developing. What we're learning now. I should say there's a whole revolution going on as we speak in evolutionary biology. The old, what used to be called Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, that you get this gradual single point mutation and then you get a little change. That's dead in evolutionary biology. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I have friends who are, and they tell me, don't even talk about that. We're way beyond that now. We're talking about we're talking about niche construction, all kinds of other mechanisms that have feedback with the environment that relate to how evolution works. But there's an important point that I also should make about your question, which is that a lot of people mistakenly think that what happens is you've got an animal walking around fine and happy, and then he gets a mutation and he evolves because of the mutation. That's not what happens. What happens is a mutation occurs in a gene that has no effect. It has no effect on the animal's survival ability. Let's say it has a very small change in the length of hair. Well,
Right,
who cares?
Nearly neutral.
Nearly neutral, exactly. Yeah. In fact, that term is used. So these neutral mutations just hang around. I mean, they don't go away. Selection does two things. It gets rid of bad mutations very quickly because animals die if they're bad enough. And it promotes beneficial mutations through natural selection. But that's very, very unusual and very unlikely. Behe is correct on that. But the point is that now you've got this animal walking around with a mutation that causes a slight increase in hair growth. And that same animal not that animal, but let's say it's great, generations removed descendant gets another mutation, which not only makes the hair a little longer, it makes it a lot longer and changes its color. And these mutations keep building up in a few animals. And then, and this is the key point, because so far nothing has changed, okay? You just have variation. What mutation does is cause variation. And now the weather suddenly gets cold. And this has happened numerous times in Earth history. All of a sudden, that little group of animals who don't even know they've been mutated, they're warmer. And not only that, the color change makes them less susceptible to predation. And so they survive. And you have an evolutionary event.
Yeah, you can get fixation of nearly neutral mutations just by chance.
Exactly.
The random sampling of the previous generation.
That's right.
Yeah, but well, I don't want to. Yeah.
No, but what you just said is
there's no tendency towards functionality with the buildup of neutral mutations.
Well,
it's really just noise that's building up in the genome, and so
it's noise until it isn't.
to...
It's noise until it isn't noise. Now, sometimes it'll never become not noise, but sometimes it will. And that's when the environment changes. Because remember, evolution is not random. It's absolutely 100% dependent on the environment. So there's no such thing as a good or a bad mutation. It depends on it. Is it better to be tall or short? I could ask people, right? Well, it depends how hot it is. If it's really hot, it's better to be short. If it's really cold, it's better to be tall. So it depends on the environment. And the other thing you said at the end there about neutral mutations is really true. We now know that most evolution is not selection based. It's actually neutral drift. So you get by chance, if you separate two populations, for example, just by neutral drift, even without any selection, they will begin to, if they can't interbreed, those populations will begin to change. And you'll end up with two different species. There may have been no selection at all. And we know that happens.
Well, yeah, I think we might have to draw.
Yeah, Behe has some interesting, and the other folks there have some very interesting points. And some of them are very valid. Some of them have been answered by evolutionists. But I think, the bottom line is that we still have a lot to learn about the evolution of living plants and animals, and we're learning it slowly. And it may be that at the end, after we've learned all we can, it may still turn out that there's a role for some miraculous intervention as well.
Yeah,
I believe there was for the origin of life. It may be also true for some, for example, the evolution of humans. I do not hold to the view, and again, I'm in a minority here among evolutionary creationists, that all human characteristics are explainable by evolution. I don't believe that's true. And that's where I agree with the timing problem. We've only been around 200,000 years. That's nothing in evolutionary time. How did we get from a primate who's running around and climbing trees and being a monkey basically to us, who write symphonies and talk to each other across continents? I mean, that doesn't happen strictly by natural selection. There's not enough time for that.
Okay, so I guess I agree with that. I generally think the evolutionary biologists are a little too easy to say, now we can explain X, Y, or Z because we've got some story to tell without actually kind of doing the math to see if it works.
Yep. I agree with that. I think I said it in the last talk I gave. Evolutionary psychology is not my favorite field. I mean, that's where you come up with explaining every human characteristic because our ancestors in the savannah did this and that, and therefore people are good or people are smart or whatever. No, that's just so story. So on that, we're on the same page.
Perhaps we'll move on to the next question. Thanks, Richard. Richard, if you have another question later on, that would be good. Let's give somebody else a chance. Judy, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was intrigued by your talking about your Holy Spirit experience. And
Okay.
I have read the book and I have heard you talk before, so I know a little bit about it, but I wonder if it would interest other people in the audience to hear how you feel that God interacted with you and how you felt that it must be God and not your own emotions.
Right. Okay. I'm not going to go into all the detail is in the book, but I will explain what happened and why I think it was real. And I did touch on this a little bit in that last talk with Trinity Western. This is after I had several dreams and I had been to church and I had been thinking about, oh, well, maybe there is a God. I don't know, but it's hard for me to get there. I can't believe, and I don't want to join a church, and I'm going to have to give up my scientific career, and all these reasons I had for holding off, and as I put it, not crossing the threshold. And I was driving from New York to Pittsburgh because I was going back and forth a lot, and that goes through a region of Pennsylvania which is very rural and has a lot of Christian radio stations. And I was listening to the radio and I heard a Christian radio station, which I usually just turned off because I didn't want to hear all that, and especially the preachers, they just kept saying stuff I didn't like. And I didn't want to be, pushed into something. So, but this preacher that I heard this time, I really liked his delivery. I didn't listen to what he was saying, but his voice was wonderful, and he was so passionate and so full of fervor. And so I was listening to him, and I turned off the radio, and I started thinking, well, I like to talk. This may be a shock to you, but I was saying I like to talk. I mean, what would it be like if I decided to give a sermon? And I started thinking, well, what would I talk about? Well, maybe I would talk about science and maybe the origin of life, which I'd already been thinking about, things like that. And then as I was thinking about that, I had some experience that I can't describe, just a feeling. And the next thing I knew, I thankfully pulled the car over to the side of the road, and I found myself preaching a sermon to an imaginary group of people who I imagined were maybe in the South, in the Bible Belt or something, all Christians. And I was a guest preacher, and I started preaching, and I what I said was not what I expected to say. What I was telling them was that basically the bottom line was that no matter what they think about themselves, God loves them because he even loves me. And when I said that, it was a realization that I was the kind of a sinner that if I merited God's love, who could not? There's a little more to it than that. I wrote down the words when I got home, and it's in the book. But when I had finished doing this preaching, and luckily I was pulled over, I just burst into tears. And I knew that the words hadn't come from me. Now, one can argue with that, but they were certainly not in my conscious mind. I had never thought about God loving me, God loving sinners. I mean, I had heard, in a few times that I'd gone to church, I'd heard sermons that describe God's love for people, but I had never thought of it. I had never consciously thought of that. And I felt very strongly, I still do, that the Holy Spirit had finally decided, I'm a hard case. The Holy Spirit's going to have to come down and just grab me and bring me over the threshold. I'm not going to get there on my own. And he did. And I was a believer from that moment. And I've never gone back, and I never will. And now the question is, how do I know that was real? And we discussed this in the last talk, Judy and I. Well, you know, there are people who've read this and said, well, yeah, you know, you had an experience, you had a mental experience. You felt that it was the voice of God, but no, it was just you wanted to, you know, you wanted to believe, and this brought you there. And why do you think it's anything more than that? And I guess my answer is, well, it was very convincing to me. And I've heard other people who've had conversion experiences of different kinds say very similar things. And it can be as simple as I mentioned last time, John Wesley, I believe, had said, you know, the founder of Methodism, said he had a warm feeling one time. And next thing, I think it was Wesley, it might have been one of the other Methodist pioneers. Annika would know, right? But he, you know, a warm feeling. Well, what does that mean? You know, that was
Warming of the heart.
warming of the heart. Thank you. By the way, my wife, Annika, is the editor, my co-editor of God and Nature, and knows everything. So whenever I don't know something, I check with her.
Perfect.
So how do I know that this was a real experience? And you know, atheists will say, well, you know, if you believe in God and you don't have scientific proof, then you have the burden of proof that your experiences are real. And I agree, I have the burden of proof, but I say that I have the burden of proof to myself. I have to prove to myself that that experience was real. And I did. And the reason I did was because I had the experience and it was very real. And I'm not delusional. I don't have a history of hallucinations or visions or delusions. So I trust it. And that's all I can say. I mean, God is not scientifically provable, but I believe is experientially provable. And this is the point I made in the Trinity Western talk, because this issue came up.
I'll just follow that up. I'm just wondering, I myself did an undergraduate in life sciences, so I share your absolute sense of awe at how we work, you know, how our chemistry, biochemistry, genetics really works. And at the end of my undergraduate degree, I was kind of overwhelmed by that. You must really love the Psalms in terms of a poetic expression of creation, as you've been describing it. Yeah.
Psalm 111.
111 is your favorite, is it? Okay.
Well, that's where the words come from. The words
Oh,
of his
okay, of
hands
course, yes.
are faithful and just.
Right, right.
I see a
Thank
question from Barbara. Is that
Okay, Barbara, yes.
Yes, hello. I'm not a scientist. I'm just an artist, but I'm just interested. Generally, is there any consideration in your theories towards integrating the idea of God's breath that gives life and God's word that creates?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are theological statements that explain very well, you know, how God created in terms of, you know, one's theological viewpoint. I don't think that can be translated scientifically. I know that the idea of breath is connected with spirit, you know, in biblical scholarship. And so when God breathed life into Adam's nostrils, that was, I view that in the scientific analogy of God providing human kind with all the aspects of a soul, which you could consider as part of consciousness, or, you know, analogous to consciousness, etc. So in that sense, you know, I think, but, you know, we have to be very careful in translating theological views and scientific views, because while I believe they all give the same truth in the end, everything else is different. So the methodologies are different. The languages are different. The concepts are different. Everything is different. But in the end, I believe they will tell us the same thing. God is the creator of everything. And that includes us, and that includes our characteristics, and it includes life, includes the rest of the universe. And you said breath, and you said one other thing. Speaking.
Breath and word, and word.
And words, right. In the beginning was the word, right. Yeah. So I love that. And I think Francis Collins might have said this at one point too. What I love about that is that we're talking about language, okay? In the beginning was the word. Well, you know, as a biologist, what do I think was in the beginning of life was the word, although we call them codons. They're part of the genetic code in DNA. So the beginning of life was, you know, the word was information. A word is information, and information is what is in DNA, and we have no clue where that came from. If it didn't come from God, we don't know where it came from. So I think there are connections, but you know, not direct. They're sort of indirect.
So I have a question from Tebby, who is a student in land and food sciences. Her question is kind of a double question. She's wondering how to reconcile the question of gender equality with Christianity. And also, you probably expected this question, that somebody was going to ask you about COVID-19 and how do we figure out what's going on with COVID-19 in the context of God's sovereignty. So I guess those two things. That may be too much for
well, no,
the next 3 hours, but yeah, maybe you can.
I'm not going to touch the gender equality because I just don't know.
Okay, maybe
that's out of my reach.
The COVID-19 is definitely in your purview.
Well, a little bit more because I have been asked this many times over the last few months. I did a podcast with Christianity Today when they were wondering about why so many, you know, Christian churches in the U.S. I don't know if this is happening in Canada, but so many Christian churches in the U.S. seem to be dismissive of the severity of COVID-19, and whether this is political or religious, I'm not clear. My guess is it's political. I don't know how many of you know what's going on in the U.S. politically. Probably you all do, and I won't say any more about that. But except to say that I'm very happy to be in Vancouver because for all I know, I may want to move there at some point in the near future, depending on what happens.
You're welcome.
But anyway, back to the question. Okay, so aside from the political nonsense that went on about, you know, not wearing masks and it's only a bad cold and all that in March and April, many churches, I think, just felt that, or people within churches felt that, you know, the scientific experts are not trustable. And there is in the US a very strong tendency now in certain parts of the country to dismiss expert advice on anything. Some of this is shown by the anti-vax movement, which has gained strength. Some of it's shown by the denial of climate change. There are many examples. And the complication of it is that it's so mixed up in the political sphere right now that it's very hard to tell whether this is a religious view or it's just coincidental with some of the political moves that are going around the country. There was a point at which churches were very upset about the idea of closing. That sort of passed because the ones that stayed open had to close eventually due to high rates of transmission of the disease. And, you know, so where is God in all this? And I think that's a fascinating question. I mentioned a little bit before that my church does all its services online, and we're not the only ones. We also have an online daily prayer session. Every day at 12 o'clock, the pastor or one of the members of the congregation leads a 15 to half hour prayer service online. And this is great for a lot of people who are shut in, who can't get out for anything, have very few personal contacts. At least they make some contact on a daily basis with other people. And it turns out that with our worship service, people are joining us from Texas. There's a family that moved to Texas with a wonderful young boy who everybody loves, and he shows up on Sunday, and you know, we all are happy. We've kind of all adopted him. And how would that happen if it weren't for online service, right? It's a blessing in the middle of this curse. And isn't that how God operates, if you think about it? Now, I'm not saying that it's a good thing that COVID came. It's clearly a horrible disaster. But I think as Christians, what we need to do is look at reality and see God's hand for what it is, which is a loving hand. And remember, we worship a God who suffered. We worship a God who died on the cross for us, who's acquainted with suffering and who suffers with us. And let's look, if we can, for those aspects of life, wherever they are, that show God's work among us. And in this case, well, I can say another thing. My wife, Aniko, is also the chair of a local charity group that distributes food to people in need and also provides finances for emergency rent payments. And when COVID hit, we were devastated because churches were no longer able to contribute food supplies, canned foods mostly. And there was a huge need of people who suddenly were unemployed and had absolutely no money. And what happened was we put out the word to our church, and they put out the word to other people, and we put a box in front of our house, and people came and dropped off food, and we never ran out. You know, there are blessings wherever you look. That's what I think. And yeah, we have to get through this, and we have to, you know, but we have to work together as Christians to get through this. And I think if we do that, we will come out the other side blessed.
Wonder if there are one or two more questions from the audience. Just, I'll give Sai a bit of a gallery view there for some of us, anyway. Anybody else?
Could I just add that my background is in neuroscience. I've taught in psychology at UBC and in biology and psychology at Trinity Western, and done research in neuroscience. And I totally agree that the origin of consciousness seems to be for everyone a really big question, whether you are a Christian or not a Christian, a theist,
Right.
not a theist. It's just an almost insolvable, well, it seems to be an insolvable question. And we get down to really weird things like, I don't know if you're familiar with David Chalmers, who's written a
Oh
lot
yeah, sure.
about consciousness, saying that perhaps consciousness is even a fundamental property of the universe,
Right,
and
right.
that even electrons and rocks and so on have some level of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how otherwise can we explain the emergence of consciousness?
Yeah, I you know, it goes along a little bit with something called panpsychism, I guess, which, but I think Chalmers' ideas are interesting. I mean, the first the first thought is, oh, come on, rocks don't think. That's nonsense. But what, we don't really know. It's, since we don't know really what we're talking about, how do we know what happens in matter, in collections of atoms? So I find that fascinating. But I'm glad to hear that, Judy, because I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychologist, and I just read a little bit about consciousness, and I came to that conclusion. It's a tough field.
And there's even quite a number of scientists now who are disagreeing with the idea that materialism explains the mind.
Oh yeah.
Thomas Nagel, and
I think Paul Davies has said things like that. So
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I see happening in general now these days is that people used to say that Christians are way behind the times in science. I don't think that's true as much anymore as atheists being behind the times in science. There's still, some of them are still using 19th century concepts, and some of them are not even really aware of what's happened in physics. And some of them are now denying the basic principles of biology. And I don't know what this means. I tend to think it means that atheism, especially the new atheism, the militant kind of, there is no God, is probably maybe on its way out, because it's no longer coherent, and it's not coherent with science.
I guess talk like this wouldn't be complete without some discussion of fine tuning and the cosmic constants. Maybe this will be our last questions. If you wanted to reflect with us a bit about how important, how you see the fine tuning of the universe fitting into your faith.
Yeah, I mean, it was a compelling argument to me once I understood it, and I have to say a lot of people don't. So it's important to understand that the fine-tuning argument is not explained by the puddle analogy at all, that famous explanation by the guy who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. I'm at that age where I can't remember names. Douglas Adams, yes.
Right.
No, that puddle analogy is nonsense. And the anthropic principle is not an explanation. There are three potential possible explanations, and there are no more. One is that there is a physical reason, a physical law or set of laws that determine the constants, the cosmological constants, and a lot of other constants to be what they have to be. Okay, so there's no room for error. Nobody has a clue what that law might be. Nobody's working on it. There's no way to even approach it that I know of. There's no evidence that there's any kind of such law. So it looks as if they're arbitrary. They could have been anything anything, and they turned out to be what they are to allow for planets and stars and galaxies. The only other solution is a multiverse where, the billions and billions of possible constant sets have all been tried or are being tried, and we got the one that works, okay? And so all the ones where, the strong constant is 0.06 instead of 0.007, those universes died, nothing happened. And we got the one that works. But that requires a multiverse, and then you have to say, where did the multiverse come from? And do we know that all the laws are different with different constants in different universes as part of the multiverse? And we don't know that. And the only other explanation is a creation by God. And the multiverse is no better scientifically than God, because there's no evidence for a multiverse, and there can never be evidence for a multiverse, because by definition, a multiverse, the other universes are outside of our universe. And so since science is the thing that explains our universe, we're not going to be able to go outside. So I'm happy with God as an explanation. I don't have any trouble with that.
Thank you. Well, maybe that's a good place to cap our discussion. Thanks so much, Sai, for just excellent answers to our questions, and also giving us a very stimulating talk. maybe sometime in the near future, we'll be able to have you come in person, in the flesh, to Vancouver, and let us know, especially if you move here. But yeah, and thanks to everyone else who has participated in this discussion, all 45 of you. I appreciate that. And David L. says to everyone, thanks for the evening. So thanks everyone for the evening, and all the best. Thank you, Sai. We'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Judy.